Do you remember when DC's animation was amazing? I'm talking about movies like Batman Mask of the Phantasm, Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero, to movies like the Batman and Superman movies, Green Lantern First Flight, Justice League Doom, or Justice League A Crisis on Two Earths. We could even go further down the line and switch up to the DC animated movie universe where we had titles like Justice League War or Justice League Dawn of Atlantis, to the Batman movies like Son of Batman, Wonder Woman Bloodlines. You get the point. I know that there's probably a few movies that I'm forgetting to name off the top of my head, but I definitely gotta throw a shout out to Batman Under the Red Hood. That's one of my favorite Batman movies ever. But the bottom line is that DC was on an unprecedented run where every movie that they dropped was amazing, or at least great. It was at least great, but then something happened. Now, before we get into this video, I do want to say be careful for spoiler warnings because I will be talking about things that happened in this universe. After the loss at the end of Apocalypse War, Flash resets the timeline, which brings us to Tomorrowverse, a reset to the DC animated movies. Now, when the Tomorrowverse was first announced, I was very excited. I liked that we were getting a different approach to DC movies. I liked that the art style was going to be different. We were going to get a whole new voice cast. Those were all things that I was looking forward to. And after watching all of the Tomorrowverse movies, some of these still hold up true. I still like the art style and I still believe that the voice cast did a great job. But the approach, that's where I have the biggest problem. But before we get into that, let's talk about the movies. The first movie that we have is Superman Man of Tomorrow. Now I have to say that Superman Man of Tomorrow is a solid movie. It's a good starting point for the Tomorrowverse. This movie did feel pretty long at times, but it served its purpose. It was a great coming of age story for Superman that allowed us to grow with the character as he tries to become a better superhero. And during this story, he fights Lobo, he meets Martian Manhunter, and he eventually fights the villain of the movie, which is Parasite. This movie even had a nice underlying message. Here we have Superman, who is an alien that resembles humans, being championed around, while we have Parasite, who was a human that got turned into an alien creature, getting villainized.
Oh my god! Wow!
It was actually some good stuff. The writers was cooking, and the film establishes that heroes and aliens exist. Now we move on to the next movie, Justice Society World War II. This movie was okay. This movie introduces us to Flash and Wonder Woman, as it has the Flash accidentally using the Speed Force and ending up in a parallel universe. But this time he gets placed in the World War II era, and he meets the Justice Society. And so basically, this movie was mainly about Flash and the Justice Society going against until he was able to find a way home. It wasn't the best, but it also wasn't the worst. And it was cool to see all the other characters. The one thing that this movie made clear was that having heroes work together would increase their chances of success. That was the main idea that the Flash carried from that world to his own world when he got back. Which brings me to my next two movies, Batman The Long Halloween Part 1 and 2. Now I know that I'm a biased Batman fan, but I have to say that these two movies were some of the best movies that came out of the Tomorrowverse. The movies were close to the comic of the same name, outside of a few changes, and also did a great job of developing the characters while not losing sight of the story. We were able to see things like Harvey's descent into madness, Bruce trying to be a better hero, and the development of Bruce and Selina's relationship while she's still trying to figure out her own family problems. And this is all going on while they're trying to figure out who the Holiday Killer is. We also got other villains and cameos in this movie that really made this movie great.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Honestly, I think that Batman The Long Halloween is the peak of the Tomorrowverse, because from here, things just went downhill. Now, at the end of The Long Halloween Part 2, Flash and Green Arrow goes to Wayne Manor to recruit Bruce Wayne, and that's how the movie cuts off. Naturally, I would expect the next movie to talk about the formation of Justice League, but that's not what happens. Instead, we get a Green Lantern movie that focuses on John Stewart's origin story, which I'm not opposed to, but it becomes a big problem. The movie starts off with a typical Green Lantern origin story of a member dying and the ring traveling to the next host, which just so happens to be John Stewart. We know how this goes, but I'm still excited to see it. But after he gets the ring, he gets teleported to the Justice League Watchtower, and it was then when I realized that they have been speed running the whole timeline. From the Superman movie till now, so much has happened and we didn't even get to see it. Naturally, it would make sense for the next movie to be a Justice League movie showing how they formed, but somehow we jumped into the future with the Justice League already formed. It's just John Stewart's origin story. John Stewart also gets put in the middle of a Thanagar-Rand war, and as he's trying to figure out what caused the war, he ends up finding Hal Jordan, who was presumed to be dead. And as this movie was already off to a wonky start for me, they made Hal Jordan the host of Parallax, basically making him the Yellow Lantern, and he got killed off. Not only was this our first introduction to Hal Jordan, but they made him evil and killed him off. It's a sad time to be a Hal Jordan fan. And with this movie ending, John Stewart basically decides to become a part of the Justice League. While this movie had questionable actions, it's not the worst movie out of the Tomorrowverse. It's one of the worst for sure, but not the worst. I will say though that this was the movie that made me start watching the Tomorrowverse through a different lens, which brings me to my next story, The Legion of Superheroes. Now this movie wasn't too bad, as it's really just Supergirl going to the future to be a part of this Legion of Superheroes. But by this point, the pattern is extremely heavy, with movies bouncing from time period to time period. We started off with the Superman coming of age story, shifted to World War II with Flash, shifted back to present day Gotham with Batman, and within the next movie, the whole Justice League is already formed, and we didn't get to see any interactions between Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, or Flash, or any other members outside of the characters that we saw in the Green Lantern movie. And in the Legions of Superhero movie, we get to see Batman and Superman working together, but we don't even know how their relationship is because we didn't get to see it develop. And that's probably one of my biggest problems with the Tomorrowverse. The Tomorrowverse relies heavily on off-screen interactions, which in return hurts the characters because outside of some of the characters that was in the movies, we don't really get to see the characters develop. And going back to the Legion of Superheroes movie, honestly, it was a solid but forgettable movie. But this movie had a setup for the Justice League, which led to probably one of the worst movies I've seen in DC animation. Justice League Warworld. Being that this was the first Justice League movie where we would see Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, I have to say it was very underwhelming. 75% of the movie was spent with the trio in dreamlike states where they were trying to figure out what they were doing and eventually how to get out. By the time they figure out what's going on and meet up with Martian Manhunter, who was kidnapped as well, they end up fighting Mongo, who just felt like a weird villain. He wasn't even in the movie long enough for us to understand him as a character. It felt like his character didn't get any justice at all. And by the end of the movie, they get sent back to the Watchtower with Warworld getting destroyed, and now it's time for Crisis. And while the next movie, Crisis on Infinite Earths, tries its best to plug in the gaps that we missed, the damage is already done. Now, I'm not sure if the Tomorrowverse had to change because of DC's new leadership, but you can honestly feel the difference between the movies going up to Batman The Long Halloween and then all of the movies that came after. There were a lot of characters that didn't get enough development and were wasted. There were a few stories that probably shouldn't have happened. But I think that the main problem is that unlike the other DC movies that came in the past, these movies just didn't feel cohesive. Oftentimes, these movies felt like Elseworld stories that were bound by the same animation and voice cast. And outside of some of the movies, some movies just felt bland story-wise. Now, I know that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Tomorrowverse will be done, but honestly, I'm okay with that. I'm ready for a new chapter. And with that being said, I'm Shanadachi, and I'm out.